At 9:40 in the morning on July 28, 1945, Lieutenant Colonel William Franklin Smith Jr. sat in the left seat of a B-25 Mitchell medium bomber, approaching Manhattan through solid overcast. The aircraft had departed Bedford Army Airfield in Massachusetts 90 minutes earlier. Smith was 37 years old, a seasoned pilot with extensive multi-engine time and a combat tour in his logbook. The war in Europe had ended 11 weeks prior. The war in the Pacific would end in 17 days, though no one yet knew that. Smith had been warned. LaGuardia Tower had relayed weather conditions 20 minutes earlier. Ceiling indefinite, visibility less than 3 miles, heavy fog blanketing the city. The controller had advised a landing at Newark. Smith acknowledged the transmission but continued his approach toward Manhattan, descending through cloud that grew denser as he dropped below 1,000 feet. In the right seat sat Staff Sergeant Christopher Dimitrovich, a qualified navigator. In the aft compartment sat Seaman Albert Perna, a Navy hitchhiker returning to Brooklyn. The aircraft carried minimal fuel for the short hop to Newark Army Air Base. At 9:49, Smith broke through the cloud base at approximately 400 feet above street level, traveling at cruising speed through a corridor of skyscrapers whose upper floors disappeared into fog. He was not where he believed himself to be. The collision between Army Air Force's Bomber 0577 and the Empire State Building was not an accident caused by weather. It was the intersection of 4 institutional systems operating under assumptions that had not been tested against the emerging reality of 1945. Military aviation doctrine shaped by wartime confidence, an urban air traffic environment designed for peacetime commercial operations, structural engineering philosophy prioritized for wind resistance over impact absorption, and a culture of pilot autonomy that treated flight rules as advisories rather than constraints. Each system functioned adequately within its own parameters. None had been designed to interact with the others under the specific conditions of late July 1945. A moment when tens of thousands of military aircraft were being demobilized through civilian airspace, when combat-trained pilots accustomed to mission priority were returning to domestic flight environments, when cities had grown vertically beyond the operational assumptions of early aviation, and when regulatory frameworks had not yet adapted to the volume, performance, and pilot culture produced by 4 years of total war. The collision was not inevitable, it was predictable. By the summer of 1945, the United States Army Air Forces had become the most capable air power in human history. It operated more than 70,000 aircraft worldwide. It had trained nearly 200,000 pilots since 1939. It had developed operational doctrine across every combat environment: strategic bombardment, tactical air support, maritime patrol, transport logistics, and photo reconnaissance. Its pilots had executed missions over Europe, the Mediterranean, North Africa, the Pacific, the China-Burma-India theater, and the continental United States. The cultural identity of the service had been forged in mission accomplishment: overcome obstacles, reach the target, complete the objective. This culture prioritized decisiveness. Pilots were trained to make rapid assessments under conditions of incomplete information. They were taught to press forward when circumstances permitted, to accept manageable risk in service of mission completion. Weather was a variable to be navigated, not a boundary that automatically terminated operations. This mindset had proven effective in wartime. Missions could not wait for ideal conditions. Targets did not reschedule themselves. The doctrine embedded in training emphasized judgment and initiative, but that doctrine had been shaped for tactical and strategic military operations, not for navigation through densely packed urban corridors under instrument meteorological conditions. The distinction had not yet been systematically addressed. Lieutenant Colonel Smith had logged more than 1,200 flight hours. He was an instructor pilot. His record showed competence, discipline, and successful mission completion across varied conditions. He was not reckless. He was confident. That confidence had been earned through experience and validated by institutional culture. It was the same confidence that allowed pilots to continue missions through flak, through weather, through mechanical failures, because mission completion was the standard against which performance was measured. On the morning of July 28th, that confidence encountered an environment it was not calibrated for. Manhattan in 1945 was the densest concentration of vertical construction in the world. The Empire State Building had opened in 1931 as the tallest structure on Earth, rising 1,250 feet from street level to antenna tip. It had been designed by Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon under engineering principles refined through 3 decades of skyscraper construction. The structural system was steel-framed with limestone and granite cladding, built to withstand wind loading far exceeding any recorded storm. The building code prioritized lateral stability. Engineers calculated stress tolerances for wind shear, thermal expansion, and seismic movement. They did not calculate for aircraft impact. No one did. The concept existed outside the design envelope. Buildings of this height were engineered for self-supporting vertical integrity. Load was distributed through a grid of steel columns and horizontal beams, creating redundancy across the structure. If a single column failed, adjacent columns absorbed the redistributed weight. The system was inherently resilient against localized damage, not because engineers anticipated collisions, but because the physics of skyscraper construction required distributed load paths to prevent cascading failure under wind stress. This redundancy was a byproduct of sound structural practice, not a deliberate countermeasure against aviation accidents. In 1931, commercial aviation was still operating biplanes and trimotors at altitudes and speeds that pose negligible risk to tall buildings. By 1945, the operational ceiling, speed, and mass of aircraft had increased by orders of magnitude, but building codes had not been revised to account for this. The gap was conceptual, not regulatory. Aviation and architecture operated as separate domains. They interacted at airports, not in city centers. Until they did. The Federal Aviation Administration did not yet exist. Civil aviation was regulated by the Civil Aeronautics Administration, established in 1940 and responsible for airway navigation, airport certification, and accident investigation. Military aviation operated under War Department authority, largely independent of civilian regulatory oversight during wartime. The distinction had made operational sense when military and civilian traffic occupied different airspace. By 1945, the distinction had become a vulnerability. Traffic control in the New York airspace was coordinated through LaGuardia Tower and Newark Tower, both responsible for managing arrivals and departures within their respective control zones. Communication between military and civilian facilities existed but was not standardized. Pilots filed flight plans when convenient, but were not required to maintain continuous contact with air traffic control once airborne. Visual flight rules permitted pilots to navigate by reference to ground landmarks under conditions of adequate visibility. Instrument flight rules required continuous communication and adherence to assigned altitudes and headings. The boundary between VFR and IFR was left to pilot judgment. This system had functioned adequately during the 1930s when air traffic density was low and aircraft performance limited. By 1945, daily operations over New York included military transports, commercial airliners, cargo flights, and ferry missions returning aircraft from combat theaters. The volume had increased. The rules had not. Lieutenant Colonel Smith's flight from Bedford to Newark did not require a formal instrument clearance. The route was short, the weather forecast marginal, but within limits for visual flight. LaGuardia's advisory to divert was exactly that, an advisory. Smith retained discretionary authority, the culture of pilot autonomy, reinforced by 4 years of mission-driven operations, placed final judgment with the aircraft commander. No regulation prohibited his decision to continue. Smith descended through the overcast, expecting to break clear above the Hudson River with adequate visibility to identify Newark across the water. Instead, he emerged from cloud at 400 feet directly over Midtown Manhattan, surrounded by structures whose upper floors remained obscured by fog. Forward visibility was less than a quarter mile. He had drifted east during descent, possibly due to wind drift or navigational error compounded by limited ground reference. He was now navigating visually through an environment that required precision instrument guidance. The B-25 Mitchell was a capable aircraft. Twin-engine, tricycle landing gear, stable handling characteristics. It had been designed for tactical bombardment, built for survivability and ease of maintenance. Maximum gross weight was approximately 35,000 pounds. Cruising speed was 230 miles per hour. At that velocity, the aircraft covered more than 300 feet per second. Decision time compressed rapidly. Smith turned right, attempting to orient toward the Hudson and re-establish visual contact with the river. The maneuver brought him parallel to Fifth Avenue, flying northbound through the canyon between skyscrapers. Visibility remained poor. The fog did not lift. He climbed slightly, attempting to gain clearance over the buildings ahead. At 9:49 a.m., the aircraft struck the north face of the Empire State Building between the 79th and 81st floors. The impact occurred at approximately 200 miles per hour. The aircraft's right wing hit first, shearing through the limestone facade and penetrating the steel frame. The fuselage followed, driving through the exterior wall and into the interior office space. Both engines tore free. The left engine passed entirely through the building, exited the south wall, and fell onto a 12-story building across 33rd Street, igniting a fire that consumed the penthouse. The right engine ricocheted inside the impact zone. Fuel from ruptured tanks sprayed across 3 floors, igniting instantly. The structural frame absorbed the collision. Steel columns buckled locally but did not fail. The distributed load system transferred force across adjacent members. The building did not list. It did not sway beyond normal parameters. The redundancy engineered into the skeleton 30 years earlier for wind resistance prevented progressive collapse. 14 people died. 11 were inside the building. Office workers on the 79th floor of the War Relief Services and the National Catholic Welfare Conference. 3 were aboard the aircraft. The fire burned intensely but remained compartmentalized within the impact floors. Fireproof floor slabs contained the blaze vertically. Masonry walls limited horizontal spread. The city's fire code, refined through decades of urban conflagrations, had mandated construction standards that inadvertently mitigated aviation fuel fires. The New York Fire Department responded within minutes. Engine companies entered from the ground floor and climbed stairwells filled with smoke and debris. They advanced hose lines to the 79th floor and fought the fire from inside the building, a tactical decision made possible by the structure's integrity. Water pressure at that height was marginal. Firefighters relied on standpipe systems integrated into the building's core. The blaze was declared under control within 40 minutes. One survivor experienced a failure that should have been fatal. Betty Lou Oliver was a 20-year-old elevator operator working on the 80th floor. The impact threw her across the corridor. She sustained severe burns and a fractured pelvis. Rescuers placed her in an elevator car to evacuate her to the ground floor. The cables, weakened by fire and impact stress, snapped. The car plunged 75 floors. She survived. The elevator shaft acted as a pneumatic cylinder. As the car accelerated downward, it compressed air in the shaft below, creating resistance that slowed descent. Emergency braking mechanisms engaged intermittently. Debris accumulating at the shaft bottom provided additional deceleration. The car hit the sub-basement at reduced velocity. Oliver remained conscious. Rescuers extracted her after cutting through the wreckage. She spent months in recovery but lived another 54 years. Her survival illustrated a principle embedded throughout the incident. Engineered systems contained failure through redundancy, even when subjected to forces beyond design parameters. The official investigation was conducted by the Army Air Forces, the Civil Aeronautics Board, and the New York City Fire Department. The findings were unambiguous. Lieutenant Colonel Smith had violated instrument flight rules by continuing VFR flight into instrument meteorological conditions. He had failed to maintain adequate altitude clearance over known obstructions. He had not coordinated with air traffic control after receiving the weather advisory. The crash was attributed to pilot error compounded by inadequate navigation and reduced visibility. The report noted no mechanical failure. The aircraft had been airworthy. The engines functioned normally until impact. Weather was contributory but not causal. Smith had possessed the information necessary to make a safe decision. He had chosen differently, but the investigation also identified systemic gaps. Military flight operations over civilian airspace lacked enforceable standards. Air traffic control possessed advisory authority, but no regulatory mechanism to compel compliance. Building codes did not account for aircraft as a structural threat. Emergency response protocols had not been tested against high-altitude fires in occupied skyscrapers. Each system had operated as designed. The collision occurred at the intersection where none of them overlapped. Repairs to the Empire State Building began within days. Structural engineers assessed the damage and concluded that the frame had performed as intended. Buckled columns were reinforced, facade panels were replaced, interior spaces were rebuilt. The building reopened to full occupancy within 2 months. The cost was approximately $1 million. The rapid restoration demonstrated both the resilience of early skyscraper engineering and the economic priority of maintaining occupancy in Manhattan's commercial real estate market. Structural failure had not occurred. Psychological failure did not manifest. The building's reputation remained intact. Tenants returned. The incident became a reference point for structural integrity rather than a symbol of urban vulnerability. But the regulatory response was slower. In the years following the collision, the Civil Aeronautics Administration and its successor, the Federal Aviation Administration, implemented incremental reforms. Instrument flight rules were tightened. Minimum altitude requirements over congested areas were codified and enforced. Air Traffic Control Authority expanded from advisory to mandatory for certain classifications of airspace. Military flight operations were gradually integrated into civilian regulatory frameworks, a process accelerated by the establishment of the independent United States Air Force in 1947. Building codes evolved more gradually. The concept of aircraft impact as a design consideration entered engineering discussions, but was not widely adopted. The statistical probability of collision remained low enough that most municipalities did not mandate structural accommodations. The Empire State Building itself became an unintentional proof of concept. Properly designed steel frame construction could survive localized catastrophic damage without total collapse. This lesson was architectural, not regulatory. The industrial context of 1945 shaped both the incident and its aftermath. The United States had ramped aircraft production to unprecedented levels during the war. In 1944 alone, American factories delivered more than 96,000 military aircraft. Demobilization meant that tens of thousands of these aircraft were being ferried, repositioned, scrapped, or transferred through domestic airspace in the months following Germany's surrender. Pilot availability exceeded peacetime demand. Training standards, optimized for rapid wartime throughput, had not yet adjusted to civilian operating environments. The cultural mindset of military aviation, mission primacy, pilot autonomy, confidence in individual judgment collided with the requirements of peacetime airspace management. The regulatory infrastructure designed for pre-war aviation could not accommodate the volume, performance, and operational culture of a demobilized Air Force. The B-25 that struck the Empire State Building was one data point in a broader statistical trend. Military aviation accidents in domestic airspace increased significantly during demobilization. Most involved navigational errors, weather-related misjudgments, or procedural deviations. The systemic causes were identical: insufficient regulatory authority, ambiguous standards, and a pilot culture shaped by wartime imperatives. Reform required recognition that the war had fundamentally altered the aviation environment. That recognition took years. Historians have reinterpreted the Empire State Building collision as an early indicator of the regulatory and infrastructural challenges posed by high-performance aviation in urban environments. In the immediate aftermath, it was treated as an isolated incident, tragic but explicable through pilot error. Decades later, particularly after subsequent aviation disasters exposed similar systemic vulnerabilities, the 1945 crash was revisited as a missed warning. The collision did not produce immediate comprehensive reform because the systems it exposed operated under different authorities and responded to different incentives. The military prioritized operational flexibility, civilian aviation authorities prioritized commercial growth, urban planners prioritized real estate development, fire departments prioritized response capability. None possessed singular authority to impose coordinated change. This fragmentation is a recurring feature of large-scale system failures. The warning signs exist within individual domains, but do not aggregate into actionable recognition until a threshold of accumulated incidents compels institutional response. The Empire State Building survived because its engineers had built conservatively. The city survived because its firefighters responded effectively. The regulatory system survived because the political will to reform it had not yet coalesced. The lesson, embedded in those three outcomes, was that resilience at the component level can mask systemic vulnerability. The collision demonstrated a principle that would recur across aviation history. Confidence, when untethered from enforceable procedure, generates predictable failure. Lieutenant Colonel Smith was not incompetent. He was operating within a culture that valorized judgment over compliance, experience over regulation, and mission completion over procedural discipline. That culture had been effective in wartime. It was unsuited to peacetime airspace management. The Empire State Building collision was not an aberration. It was a structural outcome of intersecting systems designed for different contexts. The aircraft was built for combat. The building was built for wind. The pilot was trained for missions. The city was built for commerce. None had been optimized for the moment when all four intersected at 400 feet above Fifth Avenue in heavy fog. The resilience that prevented catastrophe came from engineering conservatism, not regulatory foresight. The building stood because its designers had over-engineered it. The fire was contained because the construction code had been written for urban conflagrations. The investigation proceeded because institutional accountability mechanisms existed. But the systems that allowed the collision to occur, ambiguous regulations, fragmented authority, cultural overconfidence, required deliberate reform. That reform came incrementally, driven less by the 1945 crash than by the accumulation of evidence across subsequent incidents that the post-war aviation environment demanded coordination, standardization, and enforceable compliance. The lesson is structural. Organizations that rely on individual judgment to compensate for systemic gaps will eventually encounter conditions where judgment fails. Resilience at the component level, strong buildings, skilled firefighters, capable pilots, cannot substitute for coordination at the system level. The Empire State Building absorbed the collision, the city absorbed the loss, the regulatory system absorbed the lesson slowly. That delay is itself instructive. Subscribe for more.